Hi guys, Miss Francis here. Today we're going to talk about evolution. Evolution is the process of change over time. Lamarck was the first scientist to investigate this theory, and his theory was based on his observation of fossils. These fossils were embedded in layers of rock. We know that the rock that is closest to the surface means that it is the youngest in age. Well, what Lamarck noticed was differences in organisms that were embedded, or the fossils of organisms that were embedded in these varied rock layers. So what he stated was that species change over time. Now this went against the common thought of this time period. Everyone was very religious. They believed that God created Adam and Eve and every other organism on the planet. Now Lamarck's theory centralized on these two concepts: his idea of use and disuse, and the inheritance of acquired characteristics. So Lamarck's thoughts were, well, if you use a body part, then it's going to become larger and stronger, whereas if I don't use a body part, it's just going to deteriorate. Now, those body parts that I do use that become larger and stronger are then going to be inherited by offspring, giving rise to this idea of inheritance of acquired characteristics. That can be exemplified in giraffes, according to Lamarck. Lamarck believed that because giraffes would eat leaves from trees that were tall, they would stretch their necks. That was an acquired characteristic, which then was passed on to their offspring. Now, if you think about it, bodybuilders work their entire life to get large muscles. Does that mean that their offspring are going to acquire the trait of having large muscles? No, not necessarily. So Lamarck got that wrong. However, he did get some things right. He did provide the recognition of the fact that the earth is old, as well as the fact that organisms do adapt to their environment. So along comes Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin in 1859 published The Origin of Species, which had two main points. Basically, that there's a common ancestor and that natural selection provides the mechanism for evolution. Well, who was Charles Darwin? Charles Darwin was actually a naturalist. And at that time, most naturalists and scientists belonged to the clergy and viewed the world in the context of natural theology. Well, Darwin was going against his beliefs by investigating the science of evolution. So he started his investigation in the 1830s when he went on his ship, the H.M. Beagle, for a voyage around the world. And what Darwin focused on was these organisms, or these species that he found on the Galapagos Islands. What he noticed was that there were many endemic species, meaning that there were a lot of species that were only native to those specific islands, but that they had seemed to diversify from this mainland on South America. So while most of the animal species on the Galapagos lived nowhere else, in other words, they were endemic or native to the Galapagos, they did resemble species living on the South American mainland, and that basically they had diversified once they reached the different islands. So Darwin really focused in on finches. He observed 13 different types of finches with different beaks. And he proposed the idea that these different beaks developed as adaptations based on the food that was available on their specific island. So by the early 1840s, Darwin had developed the major features of his theory of natural selection. But in fear of rejection by the clergy, by the religion that he was a member of, he did not publish his entire works, his entire theory. However, in 1858, Alfred Wallace sent Darwin a manuscript that contained his theory of natural selection, which is basically identical to Darwin's. So Darwin knew if he wanted to get credit for his theory of evolution, if that was more important to him than being ostracized by the clergymen, then he would need to do something drastic. So what he did was Darwin quickly finished The Origin of Species and then published it the following year in 1859. And therefore, Darwin is credited with the theory of evolution by natural selection, not only because he published it earlier, but because he had developed and supported the theory of natural selection so much more. He started his investigation back in the 1830s. So again, the two main points of The Origin of Species, basically the fact that species change over time, that evolution occurs, that there is such a thing as a common ancestor, and that natural selection is the mechanism for evolution. So central to Darwin's view of the evolution of life is this idea of descent with modification. Darwin viewed evolution as a tree with branches, where each branch developed from the branch before it, and that these accumulation of modifications was what led to evolution, that these branches all came from the same trunk. So basically, here's what the evolutionary tree that Darwin might have proposed didn't look exactly like this, but this is what it looks like today. So we've got our prokaryotes represented here, your bacteria and your archaea, and you've got your eukaryotes, which include your plants, animals, protists, and fungi. You've also got these horizontal transfer lines that represents how evolution occurs among prokaryotic organisms. So basically, Darwin based his idea of natural selection on the following observations and inferences. The observation that species have the tendency to over-reproduce to ensure that at least some of those offspring survive, the fact that populations usually remain stable in size, and the fact that environmental resources such as food, water, shelter, and mates are limited, all led to this idea of there is a struggle for existence. In other words, there's a competition among individuals within populations. Another observation was the fact that individuals within a population vary, and the variations that are favorable in that environment, that best fit them to that environment, are more likely to survive and reproduce, known as survival of the fittest, where those adaptations, those variations that make the organism better fit, are going to be passed on to the offspring. The time frame by which Darwin believed evolution occurred is called gradualism, where gradualism is the idea that change results from slow, continuous processes, and it's represented by this tree. Another view stated by Stephen Gould is called punctuated equilibrium, where there are long periods of steady, of no change, and then something happens and all of a sudden there's a drastic change, producing two entirely different species. Our current view integrates ideas of punctuated equilibrium as well as gradualism. So Darwin realized that, first of all, the Earth is far older than the 6,000 years old that the Bible predicted, and that slow and subtle processes can add up to substantial change. So Darwin's main ideas, first of all, adapt or die. In other words, there is an unequal ability of individuals to survive and reproduce. The fact that the environment dictates which adaptations are better than others, and the fact that natural selection is the adaptation of populations of organisms to their environment, meaning those with the most adaptive traits will survive and then reproduce. In other words, if I have increasing frequency of the favored traits, that's known as evolution. In other words, the accumulation of the favored traits is known as evolution. So what do you need to remember? You need to remember that Vicky says old cheese smells icky. What does that mean? There are variations among individuals within a population. Populations are usually stable in general. That individuals will over-reproduce in order to, guarantee that at least some of the offspring survive. There is competition for limited resources such as food, water, habitats, and mates. That there is survival of the fittest. Those organisms that are best adapted to their environment are going to survive, reproduce, and then those offspring are going to inherit those favorable traits. Now, natural selection is situational. What do I mean? What I mean is that environmental factors vary in space and time. So what might be a favorable adaptation in one situation or one environment might be completely useless or even detrimental in another environment. So while natural selection involves interactions between individual organisms and their environment, it's not the individuals that evolve, but it's the populations that evolve. That's something that Lamarck got wrong, where a population is a group of interbreeding individuals of a single species that share a common geographic area and can produce fertile offspring. So in our next video, we're going to look at the evidence that scientists use to support their theory of evolution.